be with you today. I want to give a shout out to the people over in The Source who are joining in with us. This is usually where I get to hang out on Sunday mornings. That's where all the cool people are at. But happy to be with you guys in Current Live today as well. Hey, one of the things that I have come to realize recently is that our human nature is kind of wired towards conformity. And so there was this social experiment that was done not too long ago that the goal was to test the truth of that statement. So go ahead and check out this quick video.
To answer that question, we set up a hidden camera experiment to see if this woman would stand up at the sound of this tone, simply because everyone else is. You might be thinking you'd never go along with this. Or would you? After just 3 beeps, and without knowing why she's doing it, this woman is now conforming perfectly to the group. But what happens if we take the group away?
Elaine, please.
Okay, now she's alone. The crowd is gone and nobody is watching her, except our hidden cameras. What do you think she'll do?
Now, be honest, you're watching that and you probably are quietly, or for some of you maybe not so quietly, judging her, right? You see that and you're like, that's ridiculous. I would never, ever do that, and I thought the same thing when I was watching that video. But if you were to continue watching, at one point this psychologist comes out and begins explaining what's going on, and he says that our brains are literally wired to go along with what's happening around us because that's how we gain social acceptance. And so literally, your brain rewards you for fitting in. And the more I thought about this, I realized that's how all of us function all the time. And if you don't believe me, just imagine what it feels like if you're the person who shows up to an event wearing a t-shirt and jeans and everyone else is wearing formal wear, like how that feels. Or maybe you've experienced where you're the one person in your friends group that doesn't enjoy a particular activity. Or even for me, my wife and I have lived here a little over 3.5 years, and as hard as I have tried to fight it, I find myself saying y'all regularly. Or maybe you've been the one person at a sporting event who's the only one that's rooting for the other team. That when I was in college, I did an internship in the Chicago area over the summer, and when I went there, it was right after their hockey team, the Blackhawks, had won the Stanley Cup. And so some people invited me to go downtown to the parade that they were having to celebrate. And here's something you need to know about me. I grew up my whole life in St. Louis, and our hockey team there, the Blues, are huge rivals with the Blackhawks. I would never cheer for the Blackhawks, ever. But I go to this parade, and I've got some pictures from that day up on the screen here. And there were a ton of people there. I mean, look at that. Like, that whole street is filled to the brim as far as the eye can see. Tens of thousands of Blackhawks fans there. And you may or may not know this, but Chicago sports fans are not really known for being the most friendly toward people who root for rival teams. So there I am with a Blackhawks hat on, cheering loudly for this team that I despise just because that's what everyone else around me was doing. Because our human nature is wired towards conformity. And that's not something that's new. That's something that's existed as long as societies have been around. And it's what was going on during the time of Daniel. And so if you remember last week, we kicked off this new series where we're going through the book of Daniel. And so last week, Nathan kind of talked about this opening story where they've got these different things going on with what food are we going to eat, what food are we not. And over the next couple weeks, we're going to look at some different aspects of this story. But this story focuses on 4 Israelites, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are removed from their home city in Jerusalem, and they find themselves exiled in the city of Babylon. And there's a lot of things that happen in Babylon that go against what God has called his people to do. And so the question that's posed here is, how does one live faithfully for God when we're all wired towards conformity and when we're surrounded by a culture that worships the things that the world worships? And so these are the questions that are posed in the story we're going to look at today in Daniel chapter 3. So if you've got a Bible or a Bible app with you, you can open up to Daniel chapter 3, and we're going to be starting with verse 1. Here's what it says. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So all of these important people, they assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. And the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." So as soon as they heard the sounds of all the music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So we have King Nebuchadnezzar. He's the king of Babylon, and he sets up this image. And what the image was of, we don't really know. The story doesn't say. But it's 60 cubits high, which is about 90 feet. So the thing's really tall. And it doesn't really say why he does this, but I think we can make a pretty good guess, because if you were to just flip one page back to Daniel chapter 2, you would read this story where Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. And in the dream, he sees this statue, and the head of the statue is made of gold, and then the rest of the body is made of different kinds of metal. And so Daniel comes in to interpret this dream, and he says, well, Nebuchadnezzar, the head of gold, that represents you and your kingdom. But the rest of the body are these other kingdoms that are going to rise up after you. And so what does Nebuchadnezzar do? He builds a massive statue, but the head isn't just of gold. The entire thing is made of gold. And I think the message is pretty clear. There's no kingdoms coming after me. Like, Babylon is here to stay. There's no one, nothing that could stop us. And so he elevates himself and his kingdom to the status of God, and everyone will bow down in allegiance to this. And we see human powers, humans exalting their own power and authority, and we're all going to do this together or else be executed by fire. And so then there are these people that come to the king, and they say, hey, there's some Jews who aren't following the instructions that you just gave. And so here's what these people say to the king in verse 12. There's some Jews who you have set over the affairs of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. So here we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they essentially get ratted out by these other people in the kingdom because they're not worshiping the gods and they're not bowing before this image. And so when that happens, the reason they don't do that is because God's people, they have this long history with images. Like, it's It's the second commandment given. You've got the first commandment, don't have any other gods before me. And then the second one is literally, don't make any images to bow down before. And the Israelites get in a lot of trouble during the time of Moses for bowing down to a golden image when they make an image of a golden calf. And this goes back to the very beginning. Because if you were to go to Genesis, we see that God, he creates humans in his own image. Like God is the only one who gets to make images, and he's already done that in us, and we represent his rule, his kingdom. And so when humans make images, we elevate our own rule and our own kingdoms. And this is what Nebuchadnezzar is guilty of, but it's what our world is still guilty of today. Because all the time we elevate our own kingdoms. And it's all about having like the nicest cars, the most money, the biggest houses, climbing the ladder, whatever it is, we elevate our own kingdoms. We bow to the image every day because our human nature is wired towards conformity. So what happens next? Verse 13. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you don't serve my gods or worship the image of gold I've set up? Now when you hear the sound of all the different kinds of music, if you're ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. And then, what God will be able to save you from my hand?" And so at this point, the king is furious because by refusing to worship the image, they're dissing the king's honor, they're dissing his kingdom, they're dissing the religion of the empire, and all of that is seen as a major threat. And so in his fury, the king, he gives them one more chance to bow down before the image, one more chance to change their minds. And here's something I think is really important for us to notice. A lot of times we read stories like this and we kind of glance over them because we feel like, well, that doesn't really apply to me because that's really extreme and nobody is going around threatening me with death for my faith. No one is saying, like, abandon God or else I'll kill you. But notice that that's not what's happening in this story either. Never once does Nebuchadnezzar say, you're not allowed to worship your God. Never once does he say, you have to quit following your Jewish customs, even when these people come and tell on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's not because they worship their God. It's because they're not also bowing before the image. And man, that is our story every single day. Because we live in a world that says, yeah, that's fine that you follow Jesus. It's cool that you have faith. Do whatever you want to do on your own time, but also worship the things that this world worships. Like, follow Jesus, but don't let that stop you from running after power and status and pleasure and all of these things of this world. Follow Jesus, but also bow down to the image. And then the king poses this question: what God could possibly save you from my hand? The pride in that statement. He's elevated himself and his kingdom to the status of God. So what are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego going to do? Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Man, what does it look like to live faithfully for God in a world wired towards conformity? Sometimes it can be really hard. And it can reveal a lot about what you believe about God. And the faith that these three display here is incredible. They say, we know God can save us, but even if he doesn't, we won't worship the image. And I hope that this story is as big of a punch in the gut for you as it is for me, because these three just looked the most powerful man in the known world at the time in the eye and said, yeah, our God might let us die, but that's okay with us. We still won't worship the image. We still won't conform. And man, that is convicting to me, because the truth is, most of us would be on our knees bowing before that image just to make sure we didn't lose our job. Just to make sure that we didn't lose social status, that we didn't lose respect, just to make sure that we didn't look different. We judge, but we would be standing up in that waiting room at every single beep just to be the one person, just to not be the one person sitting down. We compromise for so little, so quickly. But these three say, even if God does not deliver us, we will not worship your gods or worship the image. So verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. His attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. So now the king has to kill them, right? Like, if you have a kid and you tell your kid to do something and they look you dead in the eyes and they're just like, no, I'm not going to do that. Like, you might literally kill them, I don't know, but even if you don't, you can't just let that go. It makes you look weak. And then if you have other kids that see you do that, well, then it's just over, right? You got to respond. So the king, he doesn't waste any time. He has them tied up, clothes and all, and tossed into the furnace. And it seems like he's right when he said, what God could possibly save you from my hand? That's not the end of the story. Verse 24. Suddenly King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw in the fire? They replied, certainly, your majesty. He said, well, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods, which means looks divine. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, royal advisors crowded around them. They saw the fire hadn't harmed their bodies, nor was a hair on their heads singed. Their robes weren't scorched. There was no smell of fire on them even. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him, defied the king's commands, were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, their houses turned into piles of rubble. Catch this. For no other God can save in this way. This king who started off by saying, what God could possibly save you from my hand, ends by saying, what God could possibly save in this way? All because these 3 refused to bow down to the same types of pressures that we face every day. They refused to worship what the world worships. And here's something that's easy to miss, but I think is really intentional. Real quick, I want to read for you each instance in this chapter that the image is mentioned, and I want you to see if you can pick up on anything here, okay? Listen to this. made an image, set it up. The image he had set up. The image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. The image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. The image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. The image of gold you have set up. The image of gold I have set up. Worship the image I made. The image of gold you have set up. The image of gold you have set up. The image of gold you have set up. Did you notice a pattern there? Notice what they all have in common. It's set up. The thing is made. It has no real power. Don't compromise for it. And we're tempted to bow to the image every single day. And we are bombarded with the pressure to run after the things of this world, the things that society places value on. And Scripture is screaming at us, it's all set up. It's all made. Bow instead to an image that has some real power. Colossians 1:15. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. In him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. That's the image we should bow to. His is the kingdom to whom we give our allegiance. And so the question for us today is, in this moment of life, which character in this story do you most identify with? Like, if you were to give yourself an honest reflection, which are you? Maybe you're King Nebuchadnezzar right now. Are you focused on building your own kingdom? On elevating the image of yourself? You want the power and the glory. You want to rule. And you expect everyone else to bow down before this kingdom you've set up. And man, if anyone gets in your way, you're ready to toss them into the fire. It sounds harsh, but it's what our world is so guilty of. It's how our world functions. I'm guilty of it sometimes. Maybe it's time for you to stop focusing on building your own kingdom and start focusing on building God's kingdom. Because, spoiler alert, if you read a little further ahead, it doesn't end very well for Nebuchadnezzar. His dream comes true, and his kingdom comes crashing down. Or maybe you're like the citizens in the kingdom of Babylon who were told, hey, this is the image we're going to worship together, and they all bowed down before it. Because we are guilty of worshiping images every single day. And the things that the world says should be most important, those are the things that we give the highest priority in our lives. And so we bow to the image of money and wealth and materialism instead of living a generous life. And we bow down to the image of popularity. Instead of viewing others as greater than ourselves, we bow down to the image of self-gratification. Instead of living a life of service, we bow down to the image of comfort. Instead of stepping out in faith, we bow down to the image of career. Instead of running after God's call on our lives, we bow down to the image of power and status. Instead of caring for those who are most oppressed in our society, we bow down to the image of sex and pleasure. Instead of viewing others as being created in the image of God, all because the world around us says, man, these are the things that you should worship. So what images are you bowing down to? It's all set up. It's all made. Maybe it's time for you to start bowing to an image with real power. The image that can change everything. The one who says, I came to give you life to the fullest. Maybe at this point in your life, you're identifying with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You're saying, I'm not bowing down to the images in this world, but it's hard. People want to throw you into the furnace for it. Man, if that's you, no. Most people look at this story and they say, yeah, see, God, He did deliver them from the furnace. And that's not entirely true. See, if God wanted to deliver them from the furnace, He could have prevented them from ever going in there in the first place. But that's not what He does. They get tossed right into the flames. But they find that God is in the furnace with them. Because see, God, He doesn't promise to keep us from exile, but He promises to be with us in exile. And ultimately, He does this through sending Jesus. And so if this is you, if this is where you're at, know that although God doesn't promise to keep us out of the fire, He promises to be with us in the fire. And we worship an image that came into this earth with us, that suffered for us, defeating the powers of sin and death so that they no longer have the final say on our lives, and so that we can confidently say, I won't bow down to the image because I have nothing to fear. I have nothing to fear. See, our human nature is wired towards conformity, but we worship an image that is greater than anything that this world has to offer. So the question for all of us today is, which image will you bow before? Which image will you bow before? Let's pray.